A life tough. I saw that film clip of Winston Churchill.
Charles Bronson was one of Hollywood's most intimidating figures, a rugged, stone-faced actor who embodied toughness in films like Death Wish and The Magnificent Seven. To the public, Bronson was the ultimate symbol of masculinity, a man's man, feared by enemies and adored by women. But behind the hardened exterior, he carried secrets that the public could never have imagined. In the final years of his life, whispers began to circulate that Bronson had made a startling confession, one that shook even those who thought they knew him best. According to close friends and insiders, Bronson privately revealed the names of several gay actors from Hollywood's golden age whom he had secretly been romantically involved with. For decades, old Hollywood had been a place of glitz and glamour on the surface. But beneath the lights and cameras, many actors lived double lives. The strict morality clauses imposed by studios forced countless stars to hide their true identities. While audiences believed they were watching icons of romance and desire, the reality was far more complicated. Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter, Montgomery Clift, these were men whose private truths were often hidden from the spotlight. That's why Bronson's supposed confession stunned fans and colleagues alike. Could the most macho star of his generation really have been connected to these hidden lives? And if so, what did his words reveal about the secret history of Hollywood itself? What Bronson admitted before his death has since become one of the most shocking revelations tied to old Hollywood, one that continues to leave fans speechless. Charles Bronson was never the type of actor anyone expected to be vulnerable. Born into poverty in Pennsylvania in 1921 as Charles Dennis Bukinski, he grew up in a coal mining family, one of 15 children. His early life was marked by hardship. His father died when Bronson was just 10 years old, and from then on, survival became the only priority. He worked in the mines as a teenager, enduring grueling conditions, and even served in World War II as a tail gunner in the Air Force. These experiences shaped the man who would later become famous for his unshakable, intimidating screen presence. When Bronson arrived in Hollywood, he wasn't polished or charming like many of the other rising stars of his time. He had rough edges, a thick accent, and a brooding demeanor. But what he lacked in conventional Hollywood polish, he made up for in raw authenticity. Directors quickly realized that Bronson had something unique, an aura of toughness that couldn't be faked. He began landing supporting roles in the 1950s, often playing villains or hardened men, and by the 1960s, he had carved out a place for himself as the ultimate tough guy. His breakthrough came with films like The Magnificent Seven, 1960, and The Great Escape, 1963, where his performances stood out even among ensembles filled with Hollywood giants. By the 1970s, Bronson became an international star, especially in Europe, where audiences adored his gritty, no-nonsense persona. Movies like Once Upon a Time in the West, 1968, and the Death Wish series cemented his reputation as a man who embodied vengeance, strength, and an unflinching moral code. To millions, Bronson wasn't just acting, he was the tough guy. Because of this larger-than-life image, Bronson's personal life was always treated as an afterthought. He was married 3 times, most famously to British actress Jill Ireland, with whom he shared a deep, passionate relationship until her death from cancer in 1990. Their marriage was seen as proof of Bronson's dedication as a husband and father. Yet, even with this public image of devotion and masculinity, there were always whispers in Hollywood that Bronson's private world wasn't as straightforward as it seemed. Part of what fueled these rumors was the contrast between Bronson's public persona and the company he often kept behind the scenes. While he never fit the mold of the polished, studio-created leading men, Bronson was still a product of old Hollywood's rigid system. He was surrounded by actors who were themselves hiding secrets, many of whom were forced into marriages and public relationships to protect their careers. In private, the reality was far more complicated. By the late 1990s, as Bronson's health declined and he stepped back from acting, friends and insiders claimed he began reflecting openly on his life and the realities of the Hollywood system he had lived through. It was during these conversations that, according to some sources, Bronson made his most shocking revelations. Behind his granite exterior, he spoke candidly about relationships and encounters that would have stunned his fans, admitting that some of Hollywood's most respected names had been his secret partners. The idea that Charles Bronson, the epitome of hard-edged masculinity, had been romantically linked to gay actors of old Hollywood was almost unthinkable to the public. But in many ways it made sense. Bronson had spent decades working in an industry built on secrets and facades. He knew firsthand how studios manipulated personal lives to maintain illusions. And unlike many stars, Bronson never seemed interested in pretending for the sake of his image. His supposed confession didn't just challenge the public's perception of him. It cracked open the carefully guarded history of Hollywood itself. As we move deeper into his story, it becomes clear why his words struck such a chord. For fans who had long idolized him as the ultimate tough guy, Bronson's admission was both shocking and strangely humanizing. It suggested that even the most rugged figures of Hollywood were not immune to the pressures of secrecy, desire, and survival in an industry obsessed with appearances. But who were these men Bronson allegedly named? What actors, forever etched into cinematic history, lived double lives that only began to surface long after their deaths? To answer that, we have to explore the secretive world of old Hollywood, the hidden romances, the forced marriages, and the men who dared to live authentically only behind closed doors. Old Hollywood was a dazzling world on the surface, filled with red carpet premieres, glamorous romances, and movie stars who seemed larger than life. But beneath the glitter, many actors carried secrets that were far too dangerous to share publicly. Studios had strict morality clauses in their contracts, and even a hint of homosexuality could destroy a career overnight. For this reason, countless actors lived double lives, and the truth about their personal relationships only trickled out decades later. It is within this hidden world that Charles Bronson's alleged private connections become so startling. Among the names most often associated with Bronson's supposed confession was Rock Hudson. Hudson was the very definition of the Hollywood leading man in the 1950s and 1960s. With his tall frame, handsome looks, and smooth charisma, he was marketed as the ultimate romantic hero. Women adored him, and studios invested heavily in keeping his image intact. Yet Hudson's sexuality was one of the industry's most poorly kept secrets behind the scenes. He was known in private circles to prefer men, though the studio forced him into a marriage with Phyllis Gates to protect his career. Some insiders believe Bronson hinted that he and Hudson had shared a private connection during their overlapping years in Hollywood, a revelation that stunned those who had always seen Bronson as Hudson's opposite, the tough, rugged figure to Hudson's polished romantic lead. Another actor whose name surfaced in whispers was Tab Hunter, the blonde, boyish heartthrob of the 1950s. Hunter later confirmed in his memoir Tab Hunter Confidential that he was gay and had endured years of deception, including staged dates with female stars to fool the press. If Bronson's confession included Hunter, it would not have been entirely surprising. Both men worked within the same industry machine, both lived under constant surveillance, and both knew the cost of being seen as anything other than straight. Hunter's gentle charm contrasted sharply with Bronson's hardened persona, but it is precisely this contrast that makes the alleged connection so fascinating. Then there was Montgomery Clift, one of the most talented and complex actors of his generation. Known for his raw, emotional performances in films like A Place in the Sun and From Here to Eternity, Clift struggled privately with his sexuality and inner turmoil. He lived in an era when being openly gay was not an option, and the weight of secrecy contributed to his battles with addiction and depression. Some speculate that Bronson may have revealed a private relationship or encounter with Clift, which, if true, would shed light on the unexpected ways Hollywood's toughest and most vulnerable stars intersected. Another name that often appears in discussions of old Hollywood's hidden gay community is Ramon Navarro, the silent film star of Ben-Hur. Though Navarro's career peaked before Bronson's rise, the Hollywood circles they inhabited were small and interconnected. Navarro's tragic death in 1968, when he was murdered under shocking circumstances, exposed the secret life he had been forced to live. Bronson's alleged mention of Navarro may have been less about romance and more about acknowledging the hidden struggles that so many actors faced. And of course, the rumors about Cary Grant and his close relationship with Randolph Scott were legendary. The two men lived together for years, sparking endless speculation, though the studios worked tirelessly to bury the story. If Bronson indeed referenced Grant or others like him, it was less about gossip and more about pointing to a truth that Hollywood had always known but never dared to admit, that some of its brightest stars had to live in shadows. What makes Bronson's confession so compelling is the juxtaposition. Here was a man who built his career on grit, violence, and unshakable masculinity, admitting, at least in private, that he had shared connections with men who spent their lives hiding from the public eye. To fans, this seemed almost impossible, but to those who understood Hollywood's dark undercurrents, it was entirely believable. Bronson had nothing left to lose in his later years, and by naming names, he peeled back the curtain on a truth the industry had spent decades trying to erase. Whether or not every detail of his confession was accurate, the impact was undeniable. The idea that Bronson, the face of Hollywood toughness, was linked to men like Rock Hudson and Tab Hunter, challenged everything people thought they knew about the industry. More importantly, it reminded fans that behind the glitz and the carefully crafted images, these stars were simply human, struggling, searching, and longing for connection in a world that demanded silence. To understand why Charles Bronson's alleged confession carried such weight, one has to look closely at the way Hollywood operated during his rise. The entertainment industry wasn't just about movies, it was about manufacturing fantasies, and the studios would do anything to protect those illusions. In an era when homosexuality was not only stigmatized but could also end careers overnight, secrecy became the rule. For gay actors, that meant living double lives carefully orchestrated by powerful studio executives and publicists. The system worked like a well-oiled machine. Stars were property, and the studios decided how their lives would look to the public. Agents, managers, and studio heads built entire narratives around their actors, complete with staged romances, orchestrated photographs, and carefully planted stories in gossip magazines. If a star was rumored to be gay, the studio's first response was often to set up a lavender marriage, a union of convenience with someone of the opposite sex, designed purely to silence whispers. Rock Hudson's hasty marriage to Phyllis Gates is perhaps the most famous example, but he was far from the only one. Tab Hunter was routinely paired with female starlets for publicity shots, even when those around him knew the truth. Behind the scenes, the threat of exposure was constant. Gossip magazines like Confidential thrived on scandal, and a single headline could destroy a career. To avoid disaster, studios often made deals with these outlets, offering up smaller scandals in exchange for burying rumors about their most bankable stars. Police departments were sometimes in on the cover-ups, too. Arrests for morals charges involving male actors were quietly erased with payoffs or favors. In this shadowy ecosystem, image was everything, and truth was dangerous. It was in this world that Charles Bronson carved his path. While he projected a no-nonsense masculine image on screen, he was not immune to the same culture of secrecy that ruled Hollywood. If Bronson indeed shared private relationships with other male stars, they would have had to exist in this hidden universe, protected by silence, secrecy, and the unspoken understanding that discovery could ruin everything. Insiders claimed that Bronson, in later years, acknowledged how suffocating that environment was, and how many of his peers were forced into lives they didn't choose simply to survive in the business. Montgomery Clift's life illustrated the cost of these deceptions. A deeply gifted actor, Clift struggled with depression and addiction, haunted by the impossibility of living authentically in a time when doing so was unthinkable. His accident in 1956, which left his face disfigured, only deepened his isolation. For men like Clift, the studio system's iron grip over their personal lives wasn't just restrictive, it was destructive. If Bronson truly had a connection with Clift, as some whispers suggest, then he would have seen firsthand how damaging this machinery could be. At the same time, men like Cary Grant and Randolph Scott found ways to quietly resist, creating a kind of private partnership that lasted for years, though never acknowledged publicly. Their relationship was treated as rumor, something the studios brushed aside with denials and distractions. For fans, the image of Grant as a suave ladies' man was untouchable, and the machine ensured it stayed that way. Bronson's supposed mention of Grant in his final years, if true, was less about scandal and more about shedding light on how many stars had lived under the weight of false narratives. The emotional toll of this system cannot be overstated. Imagine living every day with the fear that one photograph, one overheard conversation, or one betrayal could end everything. Careers, fortunes, reputations, gone in an instant. Many actors became reclusive, others leaned heavily on alcohol and drugs, and some simply lived in constant anxiety. The very industry that celebrated their talents also demanded their silence. What made Bronson's late-life admission so explosive was not just the names he allegedly revealed, but the truth those names represented. If a man as famously masculine as Charles Bronson could acknowledge private relationships with men, it exposed the fragility of Hollywood's carefully crafted myths. It showed that the studio system's web of lies was far more widespread than fans had ever been allowed to believe. Bronson's words also highlighted something else: the bravery it took for these actors simply to survive. While they may have lived in shadows, their ability to endure the pressures of the system speaks to a resilience that deserves recognition. They were not just stars. They were human beings navigating an impossible world. As the years went by and Hollywood began to change, the iron grip of the studio system weakened. Scandals still existed, but by the 1980s and 1990s, the cultural landscape had shifted enough that stories once considered career-ending could finally begin to surface. For Bronson, who lived through both eras, his final reflections weren't just personal, they were historical. By naming names, he wasn't simply confessing, he was pulling back the curtain on decades of silence. When word began to circulate about Charles Bronson's alleged confession, the reactions were immediate, passionate, and deeply divided. For some, it was a shocking revelation. How could the toughest man in Hollywood, the actor who embodied gritty masculinity on screen, have carried such secrets? For others, it was a moment of vindication, proof that even the most invincible-seeming stars were, at the end of the day, human beings navigating the same struggles as everyone else, fans who had grown up, idolizing Bronson as the steely-eyed enforcer of films, like Death Wish, were stunned by the contrast between his on-screen image and the private life he supposedly revealed. Some felt betrayed, insisting that such revelations tarnished his legacy. Others, however, saw the confession as a reminder that stereotypes of masculinity were illusions carefully crafted by Hollywood, not reflections of real men. For them, Bronson's alleged openness at the end of his life only deepened their respect. It showed honesty, vulnerability, and perhaps even courage in finally confronting truths he had long kept hidden. Hollywood insiders reacted differently. Some dismissed the story as myth-making, the product of gossip and exaggeration surrounding a star's final years. Others argued that it was entirely believable. After all, Hollywood had spent decades burying the personal lives of its biggest stars, and Bronson's generation had lived under that system longer than anyone. If he truly had connections with men like Montgomery Clift, Cary Grant, or others whispered about in those circles, it wouldn't have been scandalous so much as unsurprising. It was simply part of the fabric of old Hollywood, a fabric that had been stitched together with lies and omissions. The media predictably seized on the story. Tabloids ran with bold headlines, emphasizing the shock value, while more thoughtful outlets framed it as a larger conversation about authenticity in Hollywood. For LGBTQ+ historians, the alleged confession was significant not just for the names, but for what it symbolized. It suggested that the closet in old Hollywood was far more crowded than the public had ever been allowed to see. If even Charles Bronson, the epitome of rugged, working-class masculinity, had carried such secrets, then the old binaries of who was allowed to be gay and who was not collapsed. There was also the matter of empathy. Bronson's words highlighted the burden carried by generations of actors forced to deny who they were to survive. It sparked renewed discussion about the destructive power of Hollywood's golden age image machine. For younger audiences who had grown up in a more open era, it was difficult to fathom just how dangerous it was to be gay in Bronson's time. But for those who remembered the 1940s through the 1960s, the fear was real. Careers ended overnight, reputations shattered, lives were derailed, and yet the secrecy persisted long after the studio system crumbled. Even in the 1980s and 1990s, when Bronson was in the later stages of his career, many actors still avoided being open. A reputation built over decades could still be undone in an instant. Bronson himself, if the confession is accurate, clearly felt the weight of that silence. His decision to speak near the end of his life suggests he wanted to unburden himself, perhaps not for fame or shock value, but to acknowledge the truth and pay tribute to those who hadn't lived long enough to do the same. The cultural shift since then has been immense. Today, the entertainment industry is far more open, and stars can live publicly in ways that would have been unthinkable in Bronson's youth. Still, the echoes of that era remain. The stories of stars like Rock Hudson, Tab Hunter, and Montgomery Clift remind us of the personal costs exacted by the studio system's lies. Bronson's confession, whether believed in full or not, adds another layer to that history. It underscores just how many truths were buried under the glitz and glamour of Hollywood's golden age. For Bronson's family, friends, and fans, the confession complicated his legacy. On one hand, it added a new dimension to a man many thought they already knew. On the other, it reminded the world that actors are not their roles. The tough guy on screen was also a private man with complexities, contradictions, and secrets he felt unable to share until the very end. In that way, his story is not just about Hollywood or sexuality, it is about humanity itself, about the universal desire to be known for who we truly are. Ultimately, whether every detail of Bronson's confession was true or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is the conversation it sparked. By naming names, Bronson pulled back the curtain on decades of silence, forcing audiences to rethink the way they view both him and Hollywood as a whole. His legacy, once seen only in terms of action films and hard-edged performances, now carries a deeper resonance. He became, even if unintentionally, a symbol of the hidden history of old Hollywood, a reminder that behind every crafted image was a real person, carrying real truths and yearning to be free.